There we go. We are letting people in now. So welcome everybody. We'll be starting in just a few minutes. Actually less than that. We're just going to let everybody load onto our program. We are so happy to have all of you here tonight. Okay, Esther, I'm going to give it just another moment or two. And we're going to zoom along. All new things for all of us. Oh, I see so many names of people I know. Hi, Nada. I'm glad you're on here. I can't hear you, but I know you're out there. So I'm just saying, hi, Alice, Amy and Jerry. Okay, I'm going to start and off we go. So good evening, everyone. We're glad to see you virtually, especially on such a cold winter night. My name's Elise Ingber, and I'm the Director of the Arts at Sid Jacobson. We're thrilled we can bring you this program. It's part of the Linda and Gerald Marsden Partners with the Community. And we also thank Jewish Book Council, who are integral to bringing us these programs. Tonight, we're in a Zoom webinar. So we can't see or hear you. I know you're out there, as I was saying hello to a bunch of people. So use the chat function. You should know by now how to launch it and use that to help us ask questions and get you answers that you endeavor to hear. Please support our author, Esther Safran Foer, by purchasing her book, I Want You to Know We're Still Here. I want you to know our JCC has a lovely connection with Esther. Our own executive director, David Black, sits on the board of Yahad and Unum, and they go quite a ways back. Now, I'm very pleased to pass the mantle over to Rabbi Mishkin of Temple Beth Israel of Port Washington to give us another introduction. Rabbi.
Thank you so much, Elise. I appreciate that. And what a wonderful evening. First of all, thank you to Esther Safran Foer for making yourself available to speak to our community tonight. It's a real treat for us, and we look forward to hearing from you. I want to thank Elise and the Sid Jacobson JCC, and what a wonderful collaboration with TBI's Library Committee, which is a robust committee bringing authors to our community, the Temple Beth Israel community, many authors throughout the year, and to be able to collaborate with Sid Jacobson is really just adds to it and allows us to do that much more. So I want to thank the chairperson of the committee is Bob Epstein, and Fern Cohen, who's very involved in the committee and very supportive. Thank you to the two of you. I just wanted to say before we really begin that, again, I want to thank Esther for writing this book. I know that it was you were personally driven to get this, understand the story and to get the story out, but the fact that you have had it published and have shared it with the world is a real blessing for us. There's so many lessons we can take from all of the different parts of the story. One of the things that I was thinking about is the famous Talmudic saying that is, if you save one life, it's as if you've saved a whole world, because all of the world that you have created and your family have created, and the way that you've impacted the world, you and your family, is just extraordinary. And you know, some of that goes back to, thankfully, the kindness and the courage of people who stepped forward to save Jews who were in great danger during the Holocaust. So we look forward to hearing your words. We thank you again. It's my pleasure to hand over the Zoom screen to Bob Epstein.
Thank you, Rabbi. On behalf of the Temple Beth Israel Library Committee, it's my great pleasure to welcome everyone. We're delighted to be continuing our partnership with the JCC through Elise Ingber, who identifies distinguished Jewish Book Council authors and brings them to our community to introduce their work and celebrate Jewish literature. Special thanks to our committee member, Fern Cohen, for being our liaison with the JCC and laying the groundwork to bring Esther and her amazing story to us this evening. I'm privileged to introduce our guest speaker, Esther Safran Foer, who will discuss her beautifully written memoir, I Want You to Know We're Still Here, which is a National Jewish Book Award finalist and has received high praise internationally throughout the literary world. Esther was born in Lodz, Poland in 1946 following the war. She was the daughter of Holocaust survivors, her parents being the only members of their extended family to survive. Her mother Ethel survived, as Esther says, on the run, and her father Louis was hidden by a courageous local Gentile family. But neither would ever talk about what happened during the war. Esther would spend her early childhood in a DP camp in Germany. And in 1949, she and her parents would come to New York and thereafter settle in DC. Tragically, just a few years later, Esther's father would take his own life. Esther would go on to have a family, raise 3 sons with her husband Bert, and have a successful career. She would serve for a decade as the CEO of the historic synagogue and cultural landmark, 6th and I. In 2008, she was honored by the Forward as one of the 50 most influential Jewish leaders. But the significant gaps in her own family history, accompanied by the painful silences, left Esther unsettled and determined to unearth the mysteries of her family's past. These feelings were heightened when she learned for the first time that her father had a previous wife and daughter that did not survive the Holocaust. For years, she searched for answers, looking at family archives and genealogy databases. Her search was in some ways passed on to her sons, Jonathan, Franklin, and Joshua, all talented writers and authors. Esther acknowledges in her book that each of her sons, in part through their own books and profound interests in creating memories, would inspire her to continue her exploration into what happened to her parents before their arrival to this country in 1949. As you will soon hear, Esther decided to embark on a journey to Israel, Brazil, the Ukraine, and back to DC. She would discover a lot more than she ever imagined or expected, and was finally able to piece together the fragments of her family's heartbreaking and ultimately heroic story. It's a story of 4 generations living in the shadow of the Holocaust and preserving memories. In his review, Jeff Goldberg, editor-in-chief of The Atlantic, and a colleague of Esther's son, Frank, said, quote, "Esther is a force of nature, a leader of the Jewish people, the matriarch of America's leading literary family, an eloquent defender of the proposition that memory matters," unquote. What Esther has overcome and accomplished in her life is quite extraordinary. We are most fortunate to have her join us tonight. It is my honor to introduce our esteemed guest author, Esther Safran Foer.
Wow, thank you so much. I feel like I should quit now. You've done such a wonderful job describing the book. But let me just, I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of it. We're not going to be able to cover all of it, but as Bob said so eloquently, it's a story about family. It's a story about the Holocaust. It's certainly a story about resilience. It's a story about memory, and it was my search for the truth. And at the end, while it's a very sad and tragic past, it's also about the triumph of life. Hence the title, I Want You to Know We're Still Here. So the book is kind of divided into 3 sections: my parents' pre-war and wartime experiences, the post-war period when I entered the picture, when I was born, and then finally the search for the unknowns in our family story. What I think I'd like to elaborate on is that period that resonates for me right now, given what's going on in the world, the refugee crisis, my own family's life as refugees in post-war Europe, where we were among something like 250 to 300,000 Jewish refugees, survivors of the Shoah, of the worst catastrophe, maybe in all time, and we had nowhere to go because no one wanted Jewish survivors. So a curious fact, Bob talked about my family. I'm blessed with 3 sons who are all writers, and each of whom played a role in this story. my middle son started the journey. My boys like to tell me that I use child labor, that before I was ready to go on my own search for our Holocaust history and to fill in the missing pieces, maybe before I had the courage to do it, I was able to get them to do parts of it. So our middle son, Jonathan, when he was in his senior year in college, he was his junior year going into his senior year. He needed a topic for his thesis, and he wanted to spend the summer in Prague. Those two weren't connected. He wanted a fun summer in Europe, but he needed a thesis. And I suggested to him that as long as he was already in Prague, that he try to go into Ukraine and take a small picture that we had of my father and the family that we understood had hidden him for some part of the war. We don't know for how long, we'll probably never know for how long. And that he might find something that would result in a senior thesis. Well, he undertook the journey. He spent 5 days in Ukraine and he found absolutely nothing. Partly he didn't have all the information he needed. I didn't have all the information to give him. The good news was that he wrote a novel that was ultimately published. Everything is illuminated. Also became a movie, and it was an international bestseller. And because of that work of fiction, the real story kind of opened up for me. People started to call me and they would tell me, first of all, they would tell me how they were outraged by the novel. These were descendants of people who came from the shtetl that our families came from. And they didn't understand that this was a work of fiction. It was magical realism written by a 20-something-year-old. But then they also told me, but I know the real story. And I got several calls like that before I decided maybe I ought to find out what these people know. And indeed, there were people who knew the real story. There were people I found who knew where my father had really lived before the war. And as I started, Bob mentioned I went to Israel, Brazil. These were not intentional necessarily research trips, but when I went, I sought out survivors from these shtetls, and everybody had a little piece of information to give me. Ultimately, one of the keys to unlock, first, Jonathan opened the door for me by making getting people to give me information. And then as I went from person to person, I would be asking if they knew my father, Louis Safron, and an old man in Haifa who I met said, no, I don't. And I had a map of the shtetl. And I said, well, you must have. It looks like your family lived here and my family here. And finally he said, label from Lisht. Well, of course, people weren't using first and last names. They were using nicknames. And that became really important in identifying and putting the pieces of the story together. So this man was able to tell me that my father indeed, at the war, when the Nazis arrived, he wasn't living in Trochenbrod, which is where I had sent Jonathan, that he was in another shtetl, Lisht. And he led me to another person who remembered my father's first wife and told me her name was Zipporah. But I had heard they had a child, and there was no one who could tell me the name of this child. This child would have been my half sibling. Turns out it was a girl, my half sister, and no one even knew her name. There was no record. I searched databases. There was no record that this child was born or killed, that she even existed. There are 1.5 million Jewish children who were murdered during the Holocaust, and so many of those names don't exist. We don't know who they were, that they lived. My family wasn't killed in concentration camps, which is the usual narrative we think of when we think of the Holocaust. They were killed in what was called the Holocaust by bullets. And David Black, who is the director of the Sid Jacobson JCC, and I both work with a French Catholic priest, Father Patrick Dubois, who has made it his mission to identify and document mass graves all over Eastern Europe. There are about 1.5 million Jews, probably more than that, who were killed, like my family, bullet by bullet, by Einsatzgruppen. The concentration camps turned out to be more efficient. The German soldiers, ultimately, they had a lot of trauma from having to stand there and put a bullet in the head of a child or a woman or a man. But much of the Holocaust and much that isn't talked about was committed in this Holocaust by bullets. So Jonathan took this trip. My older son, Frank, who's actually a reporter, also interviewed my mother to get the sketches of the story together. It turned out that my mother and I, and this is not unusual amongst Holocaust survivors and their descendants, really couldn't talk about this period. Somehow it was too painful for her to talk to me, but she was able to pass on the stories to her grandchildren. They, after all, were her immortality. So my son Frank was able to get the outlines of the story. Jonathan took this trip that ultimately opened the door to so many of the answers that I didn't have. And my sons like to tell me that I really used child labor. And they're probably right, because I wasn't ready to take this story on myself. But then in 2009, Frank and I actually made the trip to Ukraine. It was a trip that we took at just the right moment in time. There were people still alive in these shtetls who remembered something about my family. And we went to a number of shtetls, and everywhere I could get a piece of information, everywhere there was a connection. People who remembered where my great-grandfather lived and where my aunts lived. They would remember stories that they either witnessed as things they witnessed as young children or things they had heard from their own parents. The part that I would like to tell you a little more about, not the journey itself, but my own birth. I was born in post-war Europe. I was born in Lodz, Poland. Lodz at that point was the crossroads of Poland. Warsaw had been totally destroyed. There were Jews who had survived who were coming from, I get the East and West mixed up. They were coming from the East trying to make their way out of war-torn Europe. And Lodz was a place that was a crossroads. It was a place where they would go to look for other survivors to see if there were family. My father and several of his partners, who were survivors from his shtetl, had a business in Lodz. It was, I'm told it was kind of like a deli or a cafe. But one of his partners who I met in Brazil told me, well, actually it wasn't. They would make sandwiches and give drinks to the soldiers and the police, but they were changing money in the back room. These shtetl Jews were quickly figuring out the currency from one country to another, and then taking that and turning it into gold. We were there. My parents were married in Lodz in May of 45. I was born in March of 46. My father's partners left shortly after I was born. It became clear that for Jews, Poland was not the place to stay. There were pogroms again. The Iron Curtain was coming down. And so my family made the decision to sneak across the border. I was 6 months old. We went in a covered wagon with a false bottom. My mother tells me that she had to essentially gag me, put rags in my mouth, cloth in my mouth, so that I wouldn't make noise on the most dangerous parts of the journey. And ultimately, we made our way to the DP camps in Germany. We ended up in the American zone. Our first camp was in Ziegenheim, Germany. And it's a really interesting period that people don't talk about. There's the Holocaust, the horror of the murder of 6 million Jews, the concentration camps, the Holocaust by bullets. But the Jews didn't just, the survivors, the 250 to 300,000 survivors didn't just go off into the sunset to live happily ever after. Nobody knew what to do with us. We stayed in a DP camp for about 2.5 years. Americans didn't want these Jews. The Canadians didn't. The South Americans didn't. The Australians didn't. And of course, Palestine was closed. The Allies originally wanted these survivors to go back home, just go back where you came from. But that wasn't an option for Jews. Their families were gone. Their livelihood was gone, their homes were gone, and there was a terror of going back to these places where everyone was murdered, sometimes with the support of some local collaborators. We ultimately made our way to America, but it wasn't easy. We came to the United States, and this is what I think about a lot as we look at the refugee crisis. We came to the United States under the 1948 DP Immigration Act. This was an act that was blatantly anti-Semitic. To quote a Canadian legislator, when they were trying to figure out how to admit these refugees, he described, when they talked about Jewish refugees, he said, none is too many. This 1948 DP Immigration Act that was passed by a Republican Congress was something that Truman didn't even want to sign because he knew how anti-Semitic it was. But it was passed on the last day of Congress and he had no option. Otherwise, he would have had to wait until Congress reconvened. It admitted 200,000 displaced persons. Of those and there were some stipulations. You had to have been in Germany by December of 1945. Most Jewish refugees had not yet made it to Germany. They were coming from the Soviet Union. They were coming from Eastern Poland, from Western Ukraine. They hadn't made it back. And the legislators who wrote this understood that. As I mentioned, I was born in Poland in 46, but I have a falsified birth certificate that says I was born in Ziegenheim, Germany, 6 months after I was actually born. Why would my parents have done that? It's something I only came to understand as I was writing this book. They did it because if they had said that I was born in Poland in 46, it would have been proof that they hadn't been in Germany by 1945. The act also called for 30% of the DPs to be farmers. Jews are not typical farmers. I found amongst my parents' papers a document which certifies that my father was certified as a first-class farmer. So fortunately, people who managed to move around the system, manipulate it, were able to sneak in. Under this act, which really didn't want us, of the 200,000 DPs that were allowed in under this 1948 DP Immigration Act, only a little over 50,000 were Jews. And it's been said that about 10,000 were Nazis. The US was trying to build up its science programs, its nuclear programs, and they were letting Nazis in, but keeping Jews out. I read a rather poignant letter from my great uncle in Brazil. Our first choice was actually to go to Brazil, where my mother had a large family, but Brazil also didn't want us. And my uncle wrote a letter and he said to my mother when we arrived, he said, I am so grateful that you have finally ended your wandering, but even in the beautiful America, there are anti-Semites. That's kind of poignant right now. So we made it to America. I'll go back to our journey. Then in 2009, after Jonathan's book was published, after I'd raised 3 sons, had a a very gratifying career and a nice marriage and all of those wonderful things, it was time for me to go back and to see what I could find. It was time for me, not my sons, but for me to confront my story personally. And it was interesting when I started writing this book, my agent had said I had done a proposal and the book was sold and in the US and in most of Europe. And I said to my agent, well, I'm going to write it with my son, Frank. He, after all, is a writer and would know how to do this. And my agent said very wisely, he said, that's not what you should do. You need to tell the story yourself. It needs your own voice. And one of the profound things for me was, of course, the search of finding people who knew my family, of finding what happened to my half-sister, of actually finding her name and being able to put it in the Yad Vashem database, being able to ultimately confirm that this child, my sister, had lived and that she was murdered. But the other thing that turned out very profound was the process of writing. And he was right. I had to tell the story myself. I had to come to terms with the story. I had to dig inside myself and tell the story of my family, of the emotions that I had very much kept bottled up inside of me most of my life. It was just a really, really profound journey. And then, I mentioned that our three sons all played a role in the book, in the story. Jonathan, in everything is in writing, everything is illuminated. Frank did some original research and then came with me on this trip to Ukraine. And I sat with him. We would go from shtetl to shtetl each day. And we'd come back and we'd eat in the local pizza restaurant. Why the pizza restaurant? Because my mother, when I left, said, whatever you do, don't eat anything they give you. She was afraid of the lard and the pork. So we found a pizza restaurant where we felt safe and had dinner every night. And Frank and I would relive the day. We'd cry. We'd talk about our memories and our feelings. And when we came back, I said to Frank, why did you agree to do this? Why did you come with me? Is it because you're a historian, because you're a journalist? And he said, no, I came as a son. And it was really profound to be able to share that journey, to share our feelings together as a mother and son, because it is also his story. And then finally, our youngest son, who wanted to take the trip but couldn't, Josh has two beautiful children, Leo and B. Leo is named for my father, and B is B Asya Foer, and she is named for my half-sister. So Asia's name is not only recorded in databases, but it lives on in this beautiful child. There's so much to tell you, but that's kind of the rough outline. And I look forward to answering your questions and talking more with Fern and Bob.
Thank you so much, Esther. That was so meaningful. And it was just wonderful to hear you adding more to the story from the book. It was just great. And I'd like to ask the first question, which is, I'm always interested in the writing process, which you just mentioned. And you had so many names of people and relationships. How did you keep track of them all? And how did you organize all the information that you had gathered?
Great question, Fern. First of all, I think because I was born into a family where my family tree had been cut to the stump, I am the person in my family and my husband's family who can build family trees in your head. Those names are really important to me. I'm the only keeper of those names. And my editor at one point, reading a draft of the book, said, you know, there are a lot of names in here that won't mean anything to anybody. Maybe we should take them out. And I said, no, you know, this is the only place those names will exist. This is the place, other than the Yad Vashem database, this is a place where those names will live on for my children. These people had no one else to remember them. And I remember them.
So what was your process like? How did you, what did you do with the information? How did you organize it when you started, before you started to write?
You know, Fern, if I were to do it today, I might do it differently, but I just sat down and I did it. I started with a big outline, a massive, I had to do a book proposal. And ultimately, the book I wrote followed that outline. I remember saying to someone, oh my God, I can't believe I'm doing, 50-page outline. And he said, you're going to thank me afterwards. And that outline, the book followed that outline. What did happen, though, in the process, and it was a hard book to organize because there's the now, there's my parents' life in the shtetls, how they survived, and this journey that we took. And it's a sad story, but when you read the book, you'll see there's also humor in it. It was life. Life is full of humor. The life in the shtetl was just like life here. I remember being shocked to hear there were abortions and divorces and everything that we know of in our own lives now. What did happen? I had the outline. My mother was dying. She lived in our house with us the last 3 years of her life. Something I'll tell you that wasn't easy, but was really wonderful because we were able to live as a multi-generational family, not in one house, but I have a son who lives up the street, and her great-grandchildren would run up to her room and see her, and they had those connections. She died on December 18th, 2018, and my book was due February 1st, 2019. So I knew I had to have it mostly written because what was I going to do? She was clearly failing. But between the time that she died and the time that I turned it in, which was only a month and a half, I was able to add a layer of emotion. I was able to say things that I don't think I could say while she was alive in my house, even though she wasn't reading over my shoulder. But there were things I was able to let go of. And I didn't realize it until after I turned it in, and my editor pointed out, wow, there's more in this. There's more emotion than was in the last draft. And I realized that things that I couldn't talk to my mother about, I apparently couldn't write about until she was gone.
That's right. Did you have writing advice from your sons?
Well, so that's also great questions, Fern. No, because I was a little intimidated. They're all three writers, and I am not a natural writer. It's not something I love doing. So I didn't share it with them until I had a pretty good first draft. And they were very gentle with me. They'd say, you might be able to strengthen this paragraph a little. But they were kind. And I was intimidated.
Well, let me go to some of the questions on the chat. Well, a comment first. Allison White from our temple comments that it sounds so inhumane and cruel, and yet for perspective, last year the refugee ceiling in the United States was 18,000, the lowest ceiling in the history of the U.S. refugee resettlement. That gives us some perspective. But she also asked, she was mesmerized by your book and story. Is it possible for us to see the knitted garment you mentioned in your book?
to see.
If I remember correctly, you mentioned it is framed and hung in your dining room. And coincidentally, she learned about it recently and she gave a website from which she learned about it.
Wow. So the picture that was in my dining room, I've changed. We painted and moved things around, but I'm going to turn on the light in my living room. Because on the mantle in my living room, if you can see that,
Oh, those are all the jars.
my jars. You know, people come in and they think nothing of it. They think it's an art installation. And it kind of is. But it is, when I went to Ukraine, I felt like I really, really wanted to bring something back. But what do you bring back from a place like this? The shtetls I visited still don't have indoor plumbing. They were probably just the way they were when my mother left in the 40s, 1940, right when the war started. So I brought Ziploc bags with me, which I carry all over the world when I travel. It's my souvenir. I will, much to the disdain of my husband, I will pick up little pieces of anything that are memories for me. And he'll say, you know, I'll have to wait till he turns around to do it, because not believe that I'll pick up a loose marble from the floor of an ancient synagogue, but I will, and it's in the collection. But I also brought back dirt from each of the shtetls, from the mass graves of where my aunts and uncles and grandparents are buried. And the night before my mother's funeral, I remembered a jar from the shtetl where her mother was buried. And my relatives are buried. There is one grave in all of Europe that I know of that has the name of a relative, and it's outside of Warsaw. My grandfather died of TB, I think in 1928, and he has a decent grave. But the rest of my family are in mass graves. And so I brought back dirt from that mass grave. I brought back dirt from my father's shtetl, from the place where his first wife and daughter were killed, from their mass grave, and brought it back and put it on his grave site. And then the night before my mother's funeral, I remembered that I had this dirt from Kolki, from where her mother is buried and her sisters. And I poured it into her grave. And what was interesting is I kept some of it. Some of it is still here. I only gave some of it. That a friend of ours, a young friend, a friend of one of my sons, said, "Can I have the jar?" I said, "Sure." And when he came to Shiva, he brought me dirt from my mother's grave. So it's, it's poignant, it's sad, but it is, we are still here. And I'll tell you what that means. When we went to these mass graves, not knowing how my son would prepare, I brought kippahs, I brought the Kaddish just in case he didn't prepare. And I also brought our annual Shana Tova card. I wanted to leave something behind in the same way that I wanted to take something back. I wanted to leave something there. Now it's kind of crazy. I'm leaving it, you know, in the forests of Ukraine where there is snow and rain and tough weather. And I decided I wanted to leave our Shana Tova card, because every year we take a picture that includes our growing family, the triumph, the children and the grandchildren, and sometimes a girlfriend that has to get photoshopped out, and a grandchild whose face has to get turned around because they don't want to be in the picture. But I took that, and Frank and I borrowed forks from the hotel, and we buried that in every mass grave. Because, I mean, I want you to know we're still here has lots of different meanings. But the literal meaning then was that I was burying it in the graves of my grandmothers, my grandfathers. And they, I'm sure, thought they were watching everybody being murdered, and they were sure that no one would be left. But in fact, we're still here.
I think people are very fascinated by not only your jars, but the suitcase you wrote about. Somebody asked if they could see the suitcase.
Hang on. My home. Okay. So when we took our trip across the Atlantic, my parents had the foresight to buy this toddler her own little suitcase so that I could feel, I guess, grown up. And I've kept it. The Holocaust Museum would like to have it, but I've chosen not to give it to them yet. And in this is a with my monogram that was knit for me by a woman in our GP camp who became my aunt. She was my second mother. I visited her several times in Israel. She had no children, but she was, every night I would say goodnight to her. And I have lots of pictures of her carrying me around the camp. And this was her farewell gift to me.
Mm.
So yeah, it's my precious suitcase, and I'm so glad you're in my house so I can share these things.
That's right. We wouldn't have been able to do that if you were talking to us at the JCC.
Go ahead.
Let me, someone asked who sponsored your actual journey from Europe to the United States.
So it was sponsored, everything was complicated. It was sponsored by, like lots of families in shtetls. My mother's aunt, husband was a third cousin, they were all intermarried. So my mother's Aunt Chaya had a husband who was my grandfather's cousin on the other side. And they sponsored us. But it turned out when it came time for sponsorship, that some of my relatives who'd been here since the turn of the last century didn't get citizenship. They just never bothered. So my aunt's husband, who was also my mother's cousin on the other side, was the one who sponsored us. And I have the paperwork. He had to promise that we would not be a burden, that he promised a job, and there's a listing of the exact place where, of course, my father never ended up working, but you had to provide that. A house where we lived, where we would not be displacing anybody else. We spent our first week or so with my great aunt, my mother telling me that she, and the interesting thing is my parents came bearing gifts. They were visiting their family that they have never met. And I have that too, kiddish cups that, that there was so much of this stuff all over Germany that had been taken from homes of people who didn't survive. And so my parents bought sets of kiddish cups, candlesticks to bring to their American family. So here we were, refugees bearing gifts. One of the funny stories my mother always used to tell is that, she came to her aunt's house and there's lunch set up. And lunch includes tuna fish, which my mother had never heard of. There's no fish in the middle of Poland. And she didn't know what to do with it. And there was a Jell-O mold. And she had no clue what Jell-O was.
I'll just ask one more question because it's getting late, but this was Bob Epstein's question, is there anything you didn't include or felt you couldn't include in the book?
I don't think so. I mean, the interesting thing is that the process of writing this book allowed me to open myself up and to talk about things that I had never talked about. To my husband of, now many, many years, to my children. We are in some ways a different family, more open, able to deal with certain emotions and openness that we probably didn't before. Because I had grown up in a family of secrets. And I'm grateful that I've had the opportunity to both do the journey and to write the book and to become, I feel I came out of it a different person.
That's a wonderful way to end. And we thank you so much. It was just a terrific visit. And we really appreciate it.
Thank you all for attending.
Pardon?
We thank everybody for attending. And Esther, thank you for the time. And thank you for taking the time to go to Ukraine and do all the research. It adds so much to all of us and our understanding. So thank you for doing the legwork for us.
Thank you. Thank you.
And may you go from success to success. Thank you to Fern, to Bob, and to Rabbi Mishkin, to David Black, our executive director, and to all of you. And may we all see each other again in person someday soon. If not, keep joining us through Zoom. We look forward to it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us,
Thanks,
Esther.
Esther.
Thank you. Bye, everybody. Thank you so much.